Nothing very eventful ever happened in my school days. I always tried to make about the best grades there was, and I liked most all of my teachers. And the only time that I was ever really upset in school was in the 6th grade. And James York, I have no idea what happened, but he and Jay Ireland got into it, and our seats were not fastened down. We had moved into the new building a couple of years before, but they hadn't got the desk nailed down. And they got into this scuffle, and the teacher was beating him with a belt. And Jay would jerk it out of his hand, and he would beat him with the buckle or whatever in, and we finally wound up with all of our desks moved over in the corner, and Jay got out and run. He never went back to school. And to this day, I cannot bear to see anybody whipped with a belt. I told Rex when Bradley was born, if he ever touched him with a belt, I'd leave him.
Yeah.
And anyhow, I finally got on to high school, and I was like all the rest of the girls. I liked the boys, and I dated a good bit through high school. And when we graduated, I had taken all college courses, and 16 courses was required then to graduate, and I had 18. And all of mine were advanced courses. And I just knew that some way, somehow, I'd get to go to college. I wanted to be a lawyer so bad. But anyway, when we graduated, I wound up as salutatorian. Polly Daniels, the girl we took first, she was valedictorian. She took mostly basket weaving and things like that. And there was only one scholarship given that year, and that was to Lise McRae, and I got it. And I didn't return it. Mama said I couldn't go, that she couldn't stay there by herself. She was afraid. And I didn't return it until they finally wrote to me and told me I had to. I cried all that day that I returned it. Now, we'll go back and pick up Max. Max was a cute little old feller. I was 9 years older than he was, and I just thought he was the living end. He was just a mess. And he had a little old spot right in the top of his head, a little old curl of hair. And when he got sleepy, he'd take his thumb and forefinger and twist that little wad of hair around and around and around. And you knew when he did that, he was going to go to sleep. And I had to tend to him a lot. And he was so rowdy, I'd have to put my knee on his belly to change his diapers, and sometimes I didn't get it done very good. And when the year that he was a little over a year old, Mama and Ozell and Carl were hauling hay, and they left me to tend to Max and cook dinner that day. I don't remember anything that I would have been going on 11 years old, I guess. I don't remember anything that I cooked that day except squash. And at dinner time, Carl had taken out a helping of squash, and he said, "How about passing me some more of that fried salt?" So I guess that I had salted it a little heavy. And Max loved horses. He loved horses. He'd sit in the swing and hold to the chain of the swing while Mama swung him, and Mama would say, "Whoa, Rhodey." Our mules was Rhodey and Sal, and Mama would say, "Whoa, Rhodey," and he'd jerk that chain as long as she'd sit there. He loved them horses with a passion. Now, well, they wasn't horses, as mules. Daddy bought them 3 years old, the year before he died, and him and Carl was coming down out of the back of barn and shook the porch off the back of barn, shed off the back of barn, and it fell on the mules and on the wagon. It pulled Mama off of the wagon, and it slung Ozell over the tongue of the wagon, and they ran plumb to the other side of the barn, and Grandpa Goforth was up on the porch, and he got them stopped. And it cut a long gash in Mama's head, and Daddy lifted that shed and pulled Mama out, and the next day it took 6 men to barely lift that shed. And Ozell was just bruised all over. They had to have the doctor for her. She couldn't walk for several days.
I'd never heard that.
Well, anyhow, going back to old Maxie boy.
And way out yonder.
That's a groundhog. It's a groundhog.
No, there's a squirrel out there.
Yeah, but out there in that field is a
Oh
groundhog.
yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah, he's a big one. He'll stand up straight.
Look at him, yeah.
Stand up straight.
And Max, he couldn't talk right plain when he was little. And they had an old cow named Juice. And she had awful horns. And one day she took in after Max, and he come around the barn, and he said old Juice was after him, and he was just a screaming and a screaming. And another thing, he couldn't talk plain. And of course, I was just 11, nearly 11, between kids.
Your Alice.
That's a big groundhog.
And he couldn't talk plain, and he'd see an airplane or anything, and he'd look up, and of course I just had him say it over and over because I thought it was so funny. He'd say, "You shit? You shit?" And Carl got him a goat, a billy goat, and he made a harness for it and all, and fixed him a little wagon, and that goat was meaner than a booger. And he got after Max one time, and Max jumped into the tobacco sled, and the old goat come in after him. And Mama just hated that goat. And we had an ice box back then that sat on the back porch. And Mama had gone that morning and had picked some peas, and she had them in her apron. And she was sitting there on the porch shelling peas in her apron. And that old goat come up, and he hopped up on that ice box like he owned it. Mama told me to get that goat off of that box. So I came out the door, and as I opened the door, he give a hop and landed right in Mama's lap, peas and all. And another thing sort of happened funny to Mama. We'd grade tobacco and we'd take it off the stick and put it under the table for Mama to grade. So Carl happened to see an old ground puppy. They're such nasty looking old boogers. And so he fixed that ground puppy right where Mama would pick up a bunch of tobacco. And Mama had the rheumatism so bad she hadn't been able to hardly move in months. And she picked up that bunch of tobacco and saw that old ground puppy on it, and she jumped plumb up and got up in the chair. She was just screaming like to tickle Carl to death. Well, I guess that's enough to say about Max, except he married Rosalie. And Rosalie was an awful good cook. She was awful talented. She had a gorgeous voice. She could play the organ and piano. Mama always had her to play under the double eagle when she was there. She was a Jenkins, and they had 3 children. They had Ray, Jean, and Bobby. And she died when she died in either 90 or 91. She was very young. And then Max married Margie, and she was a Dyson. Now let's talk about Tony a while. Tony was the sweetest little thing that ever lived. He was born 2 years before me and Rex was married. And I thought that there never had been nothing in the world as sweet as he was. And I spoiled him constantly. And the day I got married, the clothes I pulled off, I hung them on a chair. And Mama said he'd come in and he'd rub my clothes and he'd say, "Jean, Jean." But he was a beautiful baby. He was a 10-month baby. He actually went a month over. And he was a beautiful baby. And when me and Rex got married, he met us every day when we come in from work. We had to have something in that lunchbox for him. It didn't matter if it was a half-eaten apple or a piece of candy or a cookie. It had to be something. He was just as proud of one as he was the other. But he had to have something out of that lunchbox. And he loved the chickens. We raised hens, and we had an old rooster that didn't have many tail feathers, and we called him Bob. And he would run that chicken. That old rooster would flog anybody. And he'd run that old rooster all over that chicken house, and the rooster just barely stayed in front of him, so he couldn't kick him in the rear. And he'd follow him all around. He'd say, "I show you who both, old Bob, I show you who both." And he loved to watch the hens lay. And he'd get down and put his little old hands, he was 3 and 4 long then. And he'd get down and he'd put his little old hands on his knees, and he'd look up at the old hen in the nest laying, and He'd say, "If it hard work, old hen, if it hard work." And he'd get madder than a bull if we fed the chickens corn in the evening if he wasn't there. He needed to be there. And he had another funny little thing. When he got mad, he would jump straight up and down as fast as he could jump up and down and beat both ears with his hands as hard as he could beat them. And he went with his daddy out to Engelbert's one day. And Carl was never anybody to use foul language. And I don't know where this come from, but anyhow, Tony run his hand in his pocket, and he had a dime. We brought out a dime, and he said, "Daddy, where'd I get this damn dime?" And so Carl would always let him ride the mules when he'd go to water, and he'd always grab a hold of the door, the plank where the door slid across, and hang on to that, and the mule would walk on into the stable, and he'd be hanging there, and Carl would pick him up and set him down on the ground. Well, this day he forgot to grab a hold of that board, and the mule liked to drug him off on the door. And Tony says, "You know, Daddy, that just scared the shit out of me."
I'm gonna pause it right there. My battery's about to die.